Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. A podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hey everybody, welcome. I am Zevon Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Now this is a recent and a pretty famous story. In fact, there is a Lifetime original movie based on it, fictionalized but based on it. There is also now a Netflix movie based on the true account of this story. I'll tell you what the story is in a minute, be patient. So, I won't be treading new ground here, but I gotta tell you, as soon as I encountered the story you're about to hear today, I had no choice but to tell it. As you know because you listen, I tell a lot of dark, creepy, unsettling, upsetting stories. This is kinda murdery after all. But in general, discovering and then reading about a new story for the first time doesn't personally give me the heebie-jeebies. I generally don't get upset when I read stuff. At least not in a visceral, physical, pit of the stomach sort of way. Today's story is an exception to that. As I read it, I found myself feeling progressively more and more frightened. This is the story of a young family who bought their dream home in an upscale suburb of New Jersey, only to discover they had a mysterious, unexpected, undesired, and absolutely sinister neighbor. And now, I suggest that you put your personal items underneath the seat in front of you. Stow your carry-on in the overhead compartment. Let go of the worries of the day, but be sure your seatbelt is fastened. There's turbulence expected ahead. Part 1 of Kinda Murdery's telling of The Watcher, 657 Boulevard, starts now. On a warm night in June of 2014, Maria Broaddus had just finished an evening of painting at his new home in Westfield, New Jersey, when he went outside to check the mail. Derek and his wife Maria had closed on the 6-bedroom house at 657 Boulevard 3 days earlier and were doing some renovations before they moved in, so there wasn't much in the mail except a few bills and a white, card-shaped envelope. It was addressed in thick, clunky handwriting to, quote, the new owner, unquote, and the typed note inside began warmly. Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, it read. Allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. For the Broadduses, buying 657 Boulevard had fulfilled a dream. Maria was raised in Westfield, and the house was a few blocks from her childhood home. Derek grew up working class in Maine, and then moved his way up the ladder at the insurance company in Manhattan to become a senior vice president with a salary large enough to afford the $1.3 million house. The Broadduses had bought 657 Boulevard just after Derek celebrated his 40th birthday, and their 3 kids were already debating which of the house's fireplaces Santa Claus would use. But as Derek kept reading the letter from his new neighbor, it took a turn. How did you end up here? The writer asked. Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force within? 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now. My grandfather watched this house in the 1920s, and my father watched it in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. The author's reconnaissance had apparently already begun. The letter identified the Broaddus' Honda minivan as well as the workers renovating the home. It read, quote, I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. Earlier in the week, Derek and Maria had gone to the house and chatted with their new neighbors while their children, who were 5, 8, and 10 years old, ran around the backyard with several kids from the neighborhood. The letter writer seemed to have noticed. You have children. I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I've counted, the anonymous correspondent wrote before asking if there were, quote, more on the way. Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? The letter queried. Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family, or was it greed to bring me your children? Once I know their names, I will call them and draw them to me. The envelope had no return address. Who am I? The person wrote. There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I am in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I am in one. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at all the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I am one. The letter concluded with the suggestion that this message would not be the last. Welcome, my friends, welcome, it said. Let the party begin, followed by a signature typed in a cursive font that read, The Watcher. Okay, pause just a moment. I gotta say that I got completely freaked out the first time I read this story, and now I'm reading it again, recording it for you guys, and I've got the heebie-jeebies all over again. I'm like glancing over my shoulder and holding my breath. It's absolutely bone-chilling. Let's get back to it. It was after 10 p.m., and Derek Broaddus was alone. He raced around the house, turning off lights so no one could see inside. Then he called the Westfield Police Department. An officer came to the house, read the letter, and said, "What the fuck is this?" He asked Derek if he had enemies and recommended moving a piece of construction equipment from the back porch in case the watcher tried to toss it through a window. Derek rushed back to his wife and kids who were living in their old home elsewhere in Westfield. That night, Derek and Maria wrote an email to John and Andrea Woods, the couple who sold them 657 Boulevard, to ask if they had any idea who the watcher might be or why he or she had written, quote, I asked the Woods to bring me young blood, and it looks like they listened. Andrea Woods replied the next morning. A few days before moving out, the Woods had also received a letter from the watcher. The note had been odd, she said, and made similar mention of the watcher's family observing the house over time. But Andrea said she and her husband had never received anything like it in their 23 years in the house, and had thrown the letter away without much thought. That day, the Woodses went with Maria to the police station, where Detective Leonard Lugo told her not to tell anyone about the letters, including her new neighbors, most of whom she'd never met, and all of whom were now suspects. The Broadduses spent the coming weeks on high alert. Derek canceled a work trip, and whenever Maria took the kids to their new house, she would yell their names if they wandered into a corner of the yard. When Derek gave a tour of the renovation to a couple on the block, he froze when the wife said, "It'll be nice to have some young blood in the neighborhood." The Broaddus' general contractor arrived one morning to find that a heavy sign he'd hammered into the front yard had been ripped out overnight. 2 weeks after the letter arrived, Maria stopped by the house to look at some paint samples and check the mail. She recognized the thick black lettering on the card-shaped envelope and called the police. Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard, the watcher wrote. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what's in the walls yet? In time, they will. In this letter, the watcher had addressed Derek and Maria directly, misspelling their names as Mr. and Mrs. Broaddus, Braddus, instead of Broaddus. Had the watcher been close enough to hear one of the Broaddus' contractors addressing them? The watcher had boasted of having learned a lot about the family in the preceding weeks, especially about their children. The letter identified the Broaddus' 3 kids by birth order and by their nicknames, the ones Maria had been yelling. I am pleased to know your names now, and the name of the young blood you have brought to me, it said. You certainly say their names often. The letter asked about one child in particular whom the writer had seen using an easel inside an enclosed porch. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Will they sleep in the attic, or will you all sleep on the second floor? Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me to know who is in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the Watcher, who's been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on, and they kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job. It's my life, my obsession, and now you, too, are my obsession, Broaddus family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard, and now it has brought you to me. Have a happy moving in day. You know, I will be watching. Derek and Maria stopped bringing their kids to the house. They were no longer sure when or if they would move in. Several weeks later, a 3rd letter arrived. Where have you gone to? The Watcher wrote. 657 Boulevard is missing you. Many Westfield residents compare their town to Mayberry, the idyllic setting for the Andy Griffith Show. The kind of place where a new neighbor might greet you with a welcoming note. Westfield is 45 minutes from New York and a bit too slow for singles, meaning that the town's 30,000 residents are largely well-to-do families. In 2018, Bloomberg ranked Westfield the 99th richest city in America, but only the 18th wealthiest in New Jersey. And in 2014, when the Watcher struck, the website Neighborhood Scout named it the country's 30th safest town. The most pressing local issues of late, according to residents, have been the temporary closure of a Trader Joe's over a roof collapse, and the rampant scourge of unconstitutional policing, by which they mean aggressive parking enforcement. Westfield is 86% white. One activity all locals recognized as treacherous, though, is trying to buy a house. There's a lot of money and a lot of ego, one resident said. I've seen bidding wars where friends lost by $300,000. The Broaddus' house was on the boulevard, a wide, tree-lined street with some of the more desirable homes in town. As the Watcher had noted, the boulevard used to be the street to live on. You'd made it if you lived on the boulevard. Built in 1905, 657 Boulevard was perhaps the grandest home on the block, and when the Woodses put it on the market, they had received multiple offers above their asking price. That led the Broadduses to initially suspect that the Watcher might be someone upset over losing out on the house. But the Woodses said one interested buyer had backed out after a bad medical diagnosis, while another had already found a different home. In an email to the Broadduses, Andrea Woods proposed another theory. Would the mention of the contractor trucks and your children suggest that it was someone in the neighborhood? The letters did indicate proximity. They had been processed in Kearney, the U.S. Postal Service's distribution center in northern New Jersey. The first was postmarked on June 4th before the sale was public. The Woods had never put up a for sale sign. And June 4th was only one day after the contractors had arrived. The renovations were mostly interior, and people who lived nearby say they didn't notice an unusual commotion, even from the jackhammering in the basement. When Derek and Maria walked Detective Lugo around the house, they showed him that the easel on the porch was hidden from the street by vegetation, making it difficult to see unless someone was behind the house or right next door. A few days after the first letter, Maria and Derek went to a barbecue across the street, welcoming them and another new homeowner to the block. The Broadduses hadn't told anyone about the Watcher, as the police had instructed, and found themselves scanning the party for clues while keeping tabs on their kids, who ran guilelessly through a crowd that made up much of the suspect pool. We kept screaming at them to stay close, Maria said. People must have thought we were crazy. At one point, Derek was chatting with John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down, when Schmidt told him about the Langfords, who lived in between them. Peggy Langford was in her 90s, and several of her adult children, all in their 60s, lived with her. The family was a bit odd, Schmidt said, but harmless. He described one of the younger Langfords, Michael, who didn't work and had a beard like Ernest Hemingway, as a kind of, quote, Boo Radley character, unquote. Boo Radley being the mysterious and apparently, at least to children, terrifying recluse from Harper Lee's seminal work To Kill a Mockingbird. Derek thought the case was solved. The Langford house was right next to the easel on the porch. The family had lived there since the 1960s, when the Watcher's father, the letters said, had begun observing 657 Boulevard. Richard Langford, the family patriarch, had died 12 years earlier, and the current Watcher claimed to have been on the job for the better part of 2 decades. When the Broadduses told Lugo about the family, he said he already knew, and a week after the first letter arrived, he brought Michael Langford into the police headquarters for an interview. Michael Langford denied knowing anything about the letters, but the Broadduses say that Lugo told them that the narrative of what Michael said matched things in the letters. This isn't CSI Westfield, Officer Lugo later told the Broadduses. When the wife is dead, it's the husband. But there wasn't much hard evidence, and after a few weeks, the police chief told the Broadduses that short of an admission, there wasn't much the department could do. This is someone who threatened my kids, and the police are saying, "Probably nothing's gonna happen," said Derek Broaddus. "Probably isn't good enough for me." After the second letter, Derek told the cops that if they didn't take care of the situation, they would have a different kind of case on their hands. "This person attacked my family, and where I'm from, if you do that, you get your ass beat." Frustrated, the Broadduses began their own investigation. Derek became especially obsessed. He set up webcams in 657 Boulevard and spent nights crouched in the dark, watching to see if anyone was watching the house at close range. "Maria thought I was crazy," he said. Derek had maps showing when each of 657's neighbors had moved in, and the Langfords were the only ones there since the 1960s. The maps had overlays marking possible sight lines for the easel and a circle for approximate range of earshot to estimate who might have heard Maria yelling their kids' names. Only a few homes fit both criteria. The Broadduses also turned to several experts. They employed a private investigator who staked out the neighborhood and ran background checks on the Langfords, but didn't find anything noteworthy. Derek reached out to a former FBI agent who served as the inspiration for Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs. They were high school board of trustees together. And they also hired Robert Lanahan, another former FBI agent, to conduct a threat assessment. Lanahan recognized several old-fashioned ticks in the letters that pointed to an older writer. The envelope was addressed to M/M Broaddus. The salutations included the day's weather, warm and humid, sunny and cool for a summer day, and the sentences had double spaces between them. The letters had a certain literary panache which suggested a voracious reader, and a surprising lack of profanity given the level of anger, which Lanahan thought meant a less macho writer. Maybe, he wondered, the Watcher had seen The Watcher, a movie starring Keanu Reeves as a serial killer who stalks the detective trying to catch him. Lanahan didn't think the Watcher was likely to act on the threats, but the letters had enough typos and errors to imply a certain erraticism. The first letter was dated Tuesday, June 4th, but the day was actually a Wednesday. There was also a seething anger directed at the wealthy in particular. The Watcher was upset by new money moving into town. Quote, "Are you one of those Hoboken transplants who are ruining Westfield?" Unquote, and by the Broaddus's relatively modest renovations. Writing, "The house is crying from all the pain it's going through. You have changed it and made it so fancy. You are stealing its history. It cries for the past and what it used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. The 60s were a good time for 657 Boulevard, when I ran from one room to another, imagining the life with the rich occupants there. The house was full of life and young blood. Then it got old, and so did my father. But he kept watching until the day he died, and now I watch, and I wait for the day when the young blood will be mine again." Lanahan recommended looking into former housekeepers or their descendants. Perhaps the Watcher was jealous that the Broadduses had bought a home that the writer could not afford. But the focus remained on the Langfords. In cooperation with the Westfield police, the Broadduses sent a letter to the Langfords announcing plans to tear down the house, hoping to prompt a response. Detective Lugo brought Michael Langford in for a second interview but got nowhere, and his sister Abby accused the police of harassing their family. Eventually, the Broadduses hired Lee Levitt, a lawyer who met with several members of the Langford family as well as their attorney to show the letters, along with photos explaining how their home was one of the few vantage points from which the easel could be seen. The meeting grew tense, and the Langfords insisted Michael was innocent. One night, Derek had a dream in which he confronted Peggy, the eldest Langford, and demanded she build an 8-foot fence around the properties. Maria was having other kinds of dreams. One night she woke up to an especially vivid one about a man who lived nearby. He was wearing these boots and carrying a pitchfork and calling to the kids, and I couldn't get to them in time," Maria said. She thought almost anyone could be the Watcher, which made daily life feel like navigating a labyrinth of threats. She probed the faces of shoppers at Trader Joe's to see if they looked strangely at her kids, and spent hours Googling anyone who seemed suspicious. There were reasons to consider other suspects. For one thing, the police spoke to Michael before the second letter was sent, which would have made sending 2 more especially reckless. The Broadduses say that Lugo told them they wouldn't receive any more letters after he spoke to Michael. Then, there was the rest of the neighborhood to consider. The private investigator found 2 child sex offenders within a few blocks. Bill Woodward, the Broaddus' house painter, had also noticed something strange. The couple behind 657 Boulevard kept a pair of lawn chairs strangely close to the Broaddus' property. "One day I was looking out the window and I saw this older guy sitting in one of the chairs," Woodward said. He was facing the Broadduses. But by the end of 2014, the investigation had stalled. The Watcher had left no digital trail, no fingerprints, and no way to place someone at the scene of a crime that could have been hatched from pretty much any mailbox in northern New Jersey. The letters could be read closely for possible clues, or dismissed as the nonsensical ramblings of a sociopath. "It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack," said Scott Krause, who helped investigate the case for the Union County Prosecutor's Office. In December, the Westfield police told the Broadduses they had run out of options. Derek showed the letters to his priest, who agreed to bless the house. The renovations to 657 Boulevard, including a new alarm system, were finished within a few months, but the idea of moving in filled the Broadduses with overwhelming anxiety. Could they let their kids play outside or have friends over? Would they get a new letter every week? Derek priced out trained German shepherds and posted a job on a website for military veterans. The posting said, "All you have to do is work out in the backyard every day." But the Broadduses hadn't bought 657 to feel bunkered in a fortress. At the end of the day, it came down to, what are you willing to risk, Maria said. We weren't going to put our kids in harm's way. Derek had been responding to occasional alarms at the house, sometimes in the middle of the night, bringing a knife with him just in case. They were so joyous about their new home, and then within days they were all petrified. Bill Woodward, the painter, said, "I'm a stranger," and Maria was crying and shaking in my arms. It didn't help that the Watcher seemed to be getting more and more unhinged. 657 Boulevard is turning on me. It is coming after me. I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend and now it is my enemy. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass and for you to bring the young blood back to me. 657 Boulevard needs young blood. It needs you. Come back. Let the young bloods play again like I once did. Let the young bloods sleep in 657 Boulevard. Stop changing it and let it alone. The Broadduses had sold their old home, so they moved in with Maria's parents while continuing to pay the mortgage and property taxes on 657 Boulevard. I had to do things like shovel the driveway, Derek Broaddus said. Just picture that little indignity. I'd go at 5 in the morning, then come back and do it again at my in-laws. They told only a handful of friends about the letters, which left others to ask why they weren't moving in. Legal issues, they said. The friends would wonder if the Broadduses were getting divorced. They fought constantly and started taking medication to fall asleep. I was a depressed wreck, Derek said. Maria decided to see a therapist after a routine doctor's visit that began with the question, "How are you?" caused her to burst into tears. The therapist said she was suffering from post-traumatic stress that wouldn't go away until they got rid of the house. Speaking of post-traumatic stress, depression, and other mental health issues, this seems like an appropriate spot to remind you about the free 3-digit lifeline number 988 that you can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to receive immediate counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. So if you find yourself in crisis, please do call 988. Program it into your phone right now. And please always do remember that the world is a better place with you in it. You can also reach out to me. I would love to connect with you. kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on all social media. Again, please don't reach out to me if you're in acute crisis. I'm not qualified for that, but if you just want to connect with someone, share your story, share your feelings, then I would love to connect with you. Also, another reminder, Please do call 888-MURDERY and tell me your Kinda Murdery story so that you can inspire an episode of the show. Alright, back to The Watcher. 6 months after the letters arrived, the Broadduses decided to sell 657 Boulevard. They initially listed it for more than they paid to reflect the renovations they'd done. But few worlds are more gossipy than suburban New Jersey real estate, and rumors had already begun to swirl about the house that sat empty. One broker emailed to say that her client loved it, but that there were too many unsubstantiated rumors flying around ranging from a sexual predator to a stalker, and that they needed to know more. The Broadduses sent a partial disclosure mentioning the letters to interested buyers and told Coldwell Banker, their realtor, that they intended to show the full letters to anyone whose offer was accepted. Several preliminary bids came in well below the asking price, but the Broadduses weren't ready to take such a financial hit and only wanted to share the letters with likely buyers. No one got that far, even after they lowered the price. A Coldwell agent who hadn't read the letters told them in an email that they were being unnecessarily forthcoming. My friend got horrible threatening letters about her dog barking and she didn't think to disclose, the realtor said. But the Broadduses insisted. I don't know how you lived through what we did and think you could do it to somebody else, Derek said. Derek and Maria thought about what they would have done had the previous owners told them about their letter from the Watcher. The Woodses, both retired scientists, told the Broadduses that they remembered the letter they received as more strange than threatening, thanking them for taking care of the house. They say they never had any issues and they certainly never felt watched. They rarely even locked their doors. But the Broadduses felt the name alone was ominous enough to merit mentioning to a new family moving in, and on June 2, 2015, a year after buying 657 Boulevard, they filed a legal complaint against the Woodses, arguing that the Woodses should have disclosed the letter just as they had the fact that water sometimes got in the basement. The Broadduses said they hoped to reach a quiet settlement. Their kids still didn't know about the Watcher, and their lawyer assured them that, at most, a small legal newswire might pick up the story. We do some creepy stories, Tamron Hall said on the Today Show a few weeks later. This might be top 10 creepy. A local reporter had found the complaint, which included snippets of the Watcher's menacing threats, and after a belated attempt by the Broadduses to seal it, the story went viral. News trucks camped out at 657 Boulevard, and one local reporter set up a lawn chair to conduct his own watch. The Broadduses got more than 300 media requests, but with advice from a crisis management consultant referred by one of Derek's colleagues, they decided not to speak publicly to spare their kids even more attention. They vacated Westfield and went to a friend's beach house. They didn't find much peace. Maria's grandfather had a heart attack, and the friend they were staying with had a seizure. Eventually, Derek and Maria sat down with their children to explain the real reason they hadn't moved into their home. The kids had plenty of questions. Who is the Watcher? Where does this person live? Why is this person angry with us? To which Derek and Maria had few answers. Can you imagine having that conversation with a 5-year-old? Derek asked. Your town isn't as safe as you think it is, and there's a boogeyman obsessed with you. From a safer distance, the Watcher was a real-life mystery to solve. A commentator on NJ.com suggested ground-penetrating radar to find whatever the Watcher claimed was in the walls. The home inspector had already looked and told Derek the only issue was the aging home's lack of insulation. A group of Reddit users obsessed over Google Maps Street View, which showed a car parked in front of 657 that one user thought had a man holding a camera in the driver's seat. Others more rationally saw pixelated glare. The range of proposed subjects included a jilted mistress, a spurned realtor, a local high schooler's creative writing project, guerrilla marketing for a horror movie, and, quote, mall goths having fun, unquote. Mall goths having fun. Jeez, that's a stretch. Some people just thought the Broadduses were wimps for not moving in. I would never let this sicko stop me from moving into a house. Never back down from a terrorist, wrote one commenter, which irked the Broadduses. None of them have read the letters or had their children threatened by someone they didn't know, Derek said. To decide whether this person's only nuts enough to write these letters and not to do something, well, what if something did happen? In Westfield, people were on edge. Lori Clancy, who teaches piano lessons in her house behind 657 Boulevard, said that one of her students came for a lesson shortly after the news of the Watcher broke and started bawling. She was terrified to walk down the boulevard, Clancy said. At the first Westfield Town Council meeting after the letters became public, Mayor Andy Skibitsky assured the public that the watcher hadn't been heard from in a year and that even though the police hadn't solved the case, their investigation had been exhaustive. This was news to 657's neighbors, most of whom had never heard from the cops. "We are confounded as to how a thorough investigation can be conducted without talking to all the neighbors with proximity to the home," said several of them in a written letter to the local paper. I'd like to mention that I am also confounded. Every single one of the neighbors that lived even within walking or short driving distance of the Broaddus' home ought to have been interviewed the same way that the Langfords were. I mean, that's just one podcaster's opinion, but obviously, whoever was doing this lived very close to the Broadduses, and there weren't that many people that lived very close to the Broadduses. And I also don't believe that any old Joe Schmo is going to really be mentally and emotionally strong enough to hold up and continue to lie under police interrogation. I mean, I understand not wanting to upset the town, but in this case, this letter writer really was threatening the Broaddus' children. Referring to them as young blood over and over can't exactly be ignored. And in light of direct threats to the family, in my opinion, there was a rather gross dereliction of duty that occurred here. It makes you wonder if it was maybe even one of the cops or town officials who was writing the letters. And after this general outcry from the neighbors, and the glare of national attention because of the Today Show and others, Baron Chambliss, a veteran detective in the Westfield Police, was asked to look into the case. The Broadduses are victims, and I don't think they got the support they needed, Chambliss, who has since retired, said recently. Chambliss knew his colleagues had looked closely at Michael Langford. According to his brother Sandy Langford, Michael had been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young man. He sometimes spooked newcomers to the neighborhood when he did strange things, like walk through their backyard or peek into the windows of homes that were being renovated. But those who knew him said the odd things he did were usually just unusual neighborly kindness. "He goes out and gets the newspapers for me every morning," said John Schmidt, who lives next door. People who had known Michael for decades didn't think he was capable of writing the letters. It sounds to me like somebody who knew Michael and perhaps knew that he peeked in windows and was schizophrenic may have been a sicko and essentially framing Michael Langford with the letters, which is super messed up. But again, that ought to be a pretty narrow suspect pool. As Chambliss looked into the case, he discovered something surprising. Investigators had eventually conducted a DNA analysis on one of the envelopes and determined that the DNA belonged to a woman. Chambliss decided to look more closely at Abby Langford, Michael's sister, who worked as a real estate agent. Was she upset about missing a commission right next door? She also worked at the local Lord & Taylor, and Chambliss coordinated with a security guard there to nab her plastic water bottle during a shift. But Chambliss says the DNA was not a match. Not long after, the prosecutor's office gave Derek and Maria some unexpected news. They wouldn't say why or how, but they had ruled out the Langfords as suspects. The Broadduses were stunned. They had recently told the prosecutors that they planned to file civil charges against the Langfords, and they wondered if the prosecutors were lying to prevent the story from blowing up again. "My family moved to the boulevard in 1961, and we never caused a problem for anybody," Sandy Langford said. "This guy gets all these letters, and all of a sudden, people are pointing fingers." Left without a suspect, the Broadduses reopened their personal investigation. They were still coy about sharing too much with the neighbors who remained in the pool of suspects, but spent an afternoon walking the block with a picture of the watcher's handwritten envelope. They hoped someone might recognize the writing from a Christmas card, but the only notable encounter came when an older man who lived behind 657 said his son joked that the watcher sounded a little bit like him. A neighbor across the street was the CEO of Kroll, the security firm, and the Broadduses hired the company to look for handwriting matches, but they found nothing. They also hired Robert Leonard, a renowned forensic linguist and former member of the band Sha Na Na, who didn't find any noteworthy overlap when he scoured local online forums for similarities to the Watcher's writing, although he did think the author might watch Game of Thrones. At one point, Derek persuaded a friend in tech to connect him to a hacker willing to try to break into Wi-Fi networks in the neighborhood to look for incriminating documents. But doing so turned out to be both illegal and more difficult than the movies made it seem, so they didn't go through with it. Meanwhile, Chambliss and the Westfield police were also back at square one. The cops asked Andrea Woods for a DNA sample and interviewed her 21-year-old son, who was surprised to find that he'd suddenly become a suspect. A year after the fact, it was hard to find fresh leads, and the initial police canvass had been so porous that it had missed a significant clue. Around the same time that the Broadduses had received their first letter, another family on the boulevard got a similar note from the Watcher. The parents of that family had lived in their house for years and their kids were grown, so they just threw the letter away, just as the Woodses had. But after the news broke, one of their children posted about it on Facebook, then deleted the post. When investigators spoke to the family, they confirmed that the letter had been similar to the Broadduses, but its existence made the case more confusing. There wasn't a whole lot to go on, said Chambliss. One night, Chambliss and a partner were sitting in the back of a van parked on the boulevard watching the house through a pair of binoculars. Around 11 p.m., a car stopped in front of the house long enough for Chambliss to grow suspicious. He traced the car to a young woman in a nearby town whose boyfriend lived on the same block as 657. The woman told Chambliss her boyfriend was into some, quote, really dark video games, including one in which he played as a specific character called the Watcher. As for the female DNA, Chambliss figured the girlfriend or someone else could have helped. The boyfriend was living elsewhere at the time, but Chambliss said he agreed to come in for an interview on 2 separate occasions. He didn't show up either time. Chambliss didn't have enough evidence to compel him to appear, and with the media attention dying down, he dropped the case and moved on. While the Broadduses continued to be consumed by stress and fear, for the rest of Westfield, the story became little more than a creepy urban legend, a house to walk by on Halloween if you were brave enough. No one who had lived in the house before the Woodses could recall anything unusual, and it was hard for people to imagine that their idyllic neighborhood could be host to something so sinister. A woman who'd lived nearby said that after the news broke, she and 10 or so of her neighbors had gathered in the street to puzzle out who might have sent the letters. Eventually, they said, she came to a consensus. Maybe the Broadduses had sent the letters to themselves. Okay, interjecting here, people do love a good conspiracy theory because our brains want to make connections, and conspiracy theories tend to tie everything together and make everything make sense, quote-unquote sense, that is. But often, and I'm not saying I believe in zero conspiracy theories, no one please be offended by this, but often conspiracy theories are really just easy or comforting answers for simple minds. This entire group of neighborhood women, they all decided that the Broadduses must have sent the letters to themselves, probably because it made them feel safer. But if you stop to consider for a moment what it implies if the Broadduses had in fact sent the letters to themselves, it's really quite preposterous. Set aside for a moment that means they would have also had to send a letter to the Woodses and the other neighbor that the porous police canvass missed the first time around. It also means that they were such incredible Oscar-worthy or better actors that they were able to convince all kinds of professionals that they were absolutely abjectly terrified, from their medical doctors to their therapists to security firm owners to the painter they hired whose arms Mrs. Broaddus sobbed in. Not one of these people suspected for a moment that the terror, grief, anger, and general mental distress that the Broadduses were experiencing were fake. I mean, they hired Clarice from Silence of the Lambs and another ex-FBI agent, for Pete's sakes. Neither of those people thought they were faking it, and on top of that, concocting all this evidence of felonious psychological torture and then lying about it to the police and spurring an ongoing police investigation, well, that's a felony that ultimately would result in them going to prison and perhaps leaving their children as wards of the state. So with all that stacked against the idea that they were faking it, combined with the fact that no law enforcement or safety professionals, from the police to the FBI to the owner of a security firm, and no mental health professionals, from medical doctors to psychiatrists, thought they were faking it, the emotional distress they were going through, the terror, the fear for their own safety, for their children's lives, it makes it pretty ridiculous, pretty darn ridiculous to think that they were actually faking it. You have to put all that evidence on one side of the scales, all that evidence that they weren't faking it, and balance it against a group of suburban mothers wanting to make themselves feel better who decided they must be faking it because they couldn't afford their mortgage. It's absurd, really, and one more form of harassment that the Broadduses certainly hadn't earned and didn't deserve. If you can't afford a house, you sell it, or God forbid, maybe you declare bankruptcy, but concoct an elaborate scheme that involves terrorizing yourselves and your children and committing numerous felonies that'll land you in prison, that's not what you do. Not if you've got half a brain anyway, and I think it's pretty clear that the Broadduses have more than half a brain. All right, let's get back to the story. So a group of neighbors decided that the Broadduses had sent the letters to themselves. The theory, as far as it went, was that the Broadduses had suffered buyer's remorse or realized they couldn't afford the home and concocted an elaborate scheme to get out of the sale. Or Derek was cooking up some kind of insurance fraud, or they were angling for a movie deal. The Broadduses received several offers, but turned them down. Lifetime eventually released a movie called The Watcher, despite cease and desist letters from the Broadduses. Lifetime argued that the couple in its movie was biracial, and the letters were signed The Raven. Some locals found it noteworthy that over the course of the decade, the Broadduses had upgraded from a $315,000 house to a $770,000 house to a $1.3 million one, and refinanced their mortgages. A few weeks after the letters became public, the Westfield Leader published an article in which anonymous neighbors were quoted asking why the Broadduses kept renovating a home they weren't moving into, or questioning whether they had really done that much renovating at all. The Leader even cast doubt on Maria's commitment to her family's safety, citing as evidence the fact that she had a public Facebook page with a photo of her kids. The paper did note that the police had tested Maria's DNA and it didn't match. As we've just discussed, none of the theories made much logical sense. The Broadduses had answers to every question. How does someone go from a $300,000 house to a $1.3 million house in 10 years? Derek's answer, it's America. But the Broadduses weren't speaking publicly, and the rumors persisted. One Boulevard resident wrote a letter to the editor arguing that, quote, an elaborate scheme is underway to defraud the Woods family for millions of dollars, unquote. Chambliss told me some Westfield cops even bought into the theory. There were even more skeptics online. I live in a neighboring town. If these letters have been happening for a while, there is no doubt, all caps in my mind, that it would have been public way before this, Lord Fluffernutter said on Reddit. This screams scam. The Broadduses hadn't known how their neighbors would react to news about the Watcher, but they lived in the area for a decade, and Maria's family had been part of the community for much longer. So it was shocking to find themselves being accused of being con artists. To Derek, it seemed that some in Westfield preferred the conspiracy theory to considering whether their town might be home to a menace. There's a natural tendency to say, I've lived here for 35 years and nothing's happened to me, Derek said. So what happened to my family is an affront to their contention that they're safe, and there's no such thing as mental illness in their community. People don't want to believe that this could happen in Westfield. While Maria looks back fondly on her childhood, she was born a few years after Westfield resident John List infamously murdered his wife, mother, and their 3 children in their home. And she remembers a period when she and other kids were warned to look out for a strange van driving around town. My mother always told me don't have a false sense of security, she said. It wasn't that bad things were going on all the time, it was that bad things happen everywhere. She didn't want me to think that this was Mayberry. Many locals seemed more concerned that the national press might ruin Westfield's good name. Some were primarily worried about arson or vandalism or whether the Broadduses would maintain the lawn. They did. Mark Lagrippo, the neighborhood's representative on the Westfield Town Council, said that the primary concern that he heard from residents was that they were worried about their property value and the stigma on the neighborhood. The Broadduses were suddenly outcasts, not only from their own home, but also their town. Derek wanted to leave Westfield, but Maria insisted on not uprooting the kids. This person took so much from us, she said. I wouldn't let them take more. 2 years after the Watcher's letters arrived, the Broadduses borrowed money from family members to buy a second home in Westfield, using an LLC to keep the location private. But staying in the town was stressful. The first time Maria let her daughter go to the pool with friends, she stared at the tracker on her daughter's iPhone the whole time. One of their kids was in language arts class, and when the teacher led a debate about whether the family in a book they were reading should move to Westfield, the class thought they should, in part because of how safe it was. Afterward, one of the kids told the Broaddus child, "My parents told me that no matter what your family says, Westfield is safe." Meanwhile, the Broadduses still had to figure out what to do with 657 Boulevard. Their lawsuit was pending but seemed unlikely to succeed. Some states require sellers to disclose, quote, transient social conditions, unquote, like murders or possible hauntings. In a 1991 case involving an allegedly ghost-filled house, a New York court ruled that, quote, as a matter of law, the house is haunted, unquote. But New Jersey had no such regulation. A judge later dismissed the lawsuit, and the Woodses, through their attorney, declined to comment. Derek looked into renting the house to the Department of Veterans Affairs and to a company that runs halfway homes. In the spring of 2016, they put 657 back on the market, hoping it might garner more interest given how many people had reacted to the letters by saying they would have ignored them and just moved in. The Broadduses held a well-attended open house, after which Derek and Maria spent hours researching every person who signed in and comparing their handwriting to the watchers. But each time a potential buyer expressed interest and met with the Broadduses, the lawyer read them the letters and they backed out. Some cocky guy from Staten Island said, "Fuck it, I'm gonna get the house at a discount," Derek recalled. Then he reads the letters and we never hear from him again. Feeling as if they were out of options, the Broaddus' real estate lawyer proposed an idea: sell the house to a developer who could tear it down and split the property into 2 sellable homes. They thought they could get $1 million for the lot. Subdivisions like this had become common in Westfield, much to the chagrin of many locals, and 657 was one of the neighborhood's largest lots. Even so, dividing it would require the Westfield Planning Board to grant an exception. The 2 smaller lots would be 67.4 and 67.6 feet wide, just shy of the mandated 70 feet. When the proposal was publicly announced, Westfield's Facebook groups lit up. Some expressed sympathy for the Broadduses, while others pointed out that real estate is always a gamble. Another faction was convinced this was the culmination of a long con. Out of this whole scam artist story, there ends up being nothing more disturbing than this move, a local woman said. A man who coached the Broadduses' son in football said, "They were over their head from day one." The application was jarring for the neighbors, who had learned about the watcher from a lawsuit and had always found it strange that the Broadduses didn't share more information, not seeming to understand that they were following the orders from the police and trying to protect their kids. A typical Facebook conversation went like this: "Sounds like this whole watcher thing was a ploy. The owners are good people, not a ploy. Well, okay, I know nothing about them." Kristen Kemp, a friend of the Broadduses, had tried to defend them on one Facebook forum, but people started attacking her. Somebody asked, "How do we know you're not writing the letters?" Kemp said. When the planning board met to decide the application in January 2017, it had already devoted a 3-hour hearing to the issue. More than 100 residents showed up. One of them, who lived across the street and had a daughter in the same grade as one of the Broaddus' kids, had retained a lawyer to fight the proposal. Suddenly, here was a new suspect. Who but the watcher would go so far as to hire an attorney to preserve the house? After a quick discussion about a Wells Fargo branch that wanted to use brighter light bulbs than the town allowed, the room grew as tense as a suburban planning board meeting could get. James Forsch, the Broaddus' attorney, explained that the 3-foot exemption was as narrow as the easel he was using to display a map of the neighborhood. A map that showed several lots on the block that were also too small. The neighbors expressed concern that the plan might require knocking down trees and that the new homes would have aesthetically unpleasing front-facing garages. Forrest repeatedly threatened the halfway house as a possible alternative. After the lawyers, a parade of neighbors stood to speak. Glenn DeMont from across the street said the proposal would, quote, spell the end of the 600 block of Boulevard as we know it. A woman whose kids had been to the Broaddus' old home for a birthday party spoke on behalf of 9 neighbors and presented 657 Boulevard as Westfield's Alamo. "Our neighbors are constantly under attack from turf, lights, parking decks, you name it," she said. "If we can't make a stand on Boulevard, where can we?" At one point, Abby Langford stood up to say that she'd spent almost 60 years looking at a magnificent, beautiful house, and didn't want to be looking out at a driveway. The hearing lasted 4 hours, during which there was little discussion of the reason the Broadduses had been driven to tear down their dream home in the first place. "Has anybody thought about whether or not this lunatic who did this has been apprehended?" said Tom Higgins, who lived across the street, toward the end of the hearing. Even so, Higgins pointed out that there was no guarantee the watcher wouldn't send letters to the 2 houses, and he argued that aesthetics should rule the day. "Putting up 2 houses there is going to stick out like an old client of mine in Texas told me. It's going to stick out like a dog's balls." Wow, that's colorful. While some of the neighbors expressed compassion, their focus remained on what the Broadduses stood to gain financially and what they themselves might lose. At 11:30 p.m., the board unanimously rejected the proposal. A New Jersey judge later denied the Broadduses' appeal of the decision. Derek and Maria were distraught. Even if the plan had gone through, it would only have staunched their financial bleeding. On top of the mortgage and the renovations, they'd spent around $100,000 in Westfield property taxes. The town denied their request for relief. They also spent at least that much money investigating the Watcher and exploring ways to deal with the home, not to mention cleaning the gutters. The Broadduses recognized that 657 Boulevard was a beautiful house on a beautiful street and that it was worth maintaining, but they were surprised their neighbors didn't see the uniqueness of the situation. "This is my town," Maria said. "I grew up here. I came back. I chose to raise my kids here. You know what we've been through. You had the ability 2.5 years into the nightmare to make it better. And you've decided that this house is more important than we are." That's really how it felt. On top of all that, her dad had recently died unexpectedly. Father Michael Saporito, the priest who blessed the house, went to one of the planning board meetings and said he was taken aback by how many people had come up to him and said they thought the whole thing was a hoax. "I think the human element of this story was kind of lost on the neighbors," Saporito said. The Watcher had expressed the desire to protect the boulevard from change, but instead it had been torn apart. Not long after the planning board's decision, the Broadduses got some good news. A family with grown children and 2 big dogs had agreed to rent 657 Boulevard. The renter said he wasn't worried about the Watcher, although there was a clause in the lease that let him out in case of another letter. 2 weeks later, Derek went to 657 to deal with squirrels who'd taken up residence in the roof, and the renter handed him an envelope that had just arrived. It was addressed to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. This letter, 2.5 years after the Watcher appeared, came out of nowhere. It was dated February 13th, the day the Broadduses gave depositions in their lawsuits against the Woodses. And it read, "You wonder who the Watcher is? Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know, and you're too scared to tell anyone. Good move." The letter was less stylish and more wrathful than the others, and it seemed the writer had been following the story closely. They'd seen the media coverage. "I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighborhood and mocked me. They also saw Derek's surreptitious investigatory efforts. I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. And the attempt to tear down the house. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates," the letter read. "My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher." The renter was mentioned. He was spooked but agreed to stay if the Broadduses installed cameras around the house. The letter indicated that revenge could come in many forms. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break. Oh my God, this is absolutely spine-chillingly awful. Whoever this Watcher is, they are truly a monster. "It was like we were back at the beginning," said Maria, but it also meant fresh evidence that might help invigorate the investigation. Derek took the letter to police headquarters, where a detective looked at a neighborhood map and traced a circle around the house 300 yards in diameter, suggesting that the Watcher must be somewhere in there. Derek drew one much closer. "In my view, it's one of 10 houses in the world," he said. The Broadduses continued to press the case, but there still wasn't much for law enforcement to go on, and it was possible to look up and down the street and see the Watcher in practically anyone. Residents mentioned to me a teenager whose father had grown up around the corner, and a man who sometimes walked around the neighborhood playing a flute. An elderly couple behind the house had been there for 47 years. The husband was the man Bill Woodward had seen sitting in a lawn chair looking at the Broadduses' house. One of their kids had married a man who grew up in, of all places, 657 Boulevard. But these were bits of information that could mean everything or nothing depending on how hard you looked at them. The Broadduses sent new names to the investigators whenever they found something odd, but their greatest fear was that the Watcher could be someone they'd never suspect. In the spring of 2018, Derek drove past 657 Boulevard, which he and Maria tried to avoid unless they had to pick up a tax bill. "It's all beautiful trees and beautiful houses, but all I feel is anxious," Derek said. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, What would my life be like if this didn't happen? We lost Christmas a couple times and you don't get that back. Christmas with a 5-year-old. The Broadduses no longer live in ever-present fear that the Watcher might strike at any moment, but they continue to deal with the lingering effects of the letters. They have a new tenant at 657, but the rent doesn't cover the mortgage. Their kids are occasionally teased at school, and the conspiratorial rumors persist. They try to avoid the people who spoke out against the planning board application or accuse them of being con artists, but suburban life makes that impossible. I see these people on the soccer field, at the train station, and my heart starts going like it did when I played hockey and I was about to get in a fight, Derek said. When Maria found herself in a spin class at the YMCA with the head of the planning board, she went up afterwards and told him, "You continue to hurt my family every day." Early in 2018, the planning board approved splitting a lot around the corner that required an even larger exemption than the Broadduses. Wow, that is messed up. Around the corner from the Broaddus' house, the planning board is allowing the plan that the Broadduses wanted when the exception has to be even larger? Who are these people in Westfield? Most people in Westfield rarely think of the Watcher anymore. The real estate market is doing fine. Many were surprised to find out that the Broadduses were still dealing with the problem. Hindsight made Derek and Maria wonder if they should have sold the house at a loss early on, and 657 Boulevard conjured too much emotional pain for them to ever consider moving in. They hope that a few years of renting the place without incident will help them sell it. The prosecutor's office was continuing its investigation, but the Broadduses knew it was unlikely the Watcher would ever be caught and that the legal punishment would probably be minimal. But the Watcher was no longer the only person sending anonymous letters in Westfield. Christmas Eve, several families received an envelope in their mailboxes. They'd been delivered by hand to the homes of people who had been the most vocal in criticizing the Broadduses online. One of them, who lived a few blocks down the boulevard, had written on Facebook, "I wish we could go back to the days of tar and feathers. I have just the couple in mind." Another family who got a letter said that it was, quote, weirdly poetic, unquote, as the Watchers had been, and that it accused the families of speculating inaccurately about the Broadduses. It included several stories about recent acts of domestic terrorism in which signs of brewing mental illness had gone unnoticed. The typed letters were signed, "Friends of the Broaddus family." The letter writer had clearly been infected not only with the Watcher's penchant for anonymous notes, but also a simmering resentment, one that had snaked its way through Westfield, making enemies of neighbors. The people who received the letters didn't know who sent them, but the tone had a familiar ring. When New York Magazine reporter Reeves Weidman, who wrote this story, asked Derek Broaddus whether he had written them, whether Derek had written them, Derek paused for a moment, then admitted he had. He wasn't proud of it. He hadn't even told his wife, and he said they were the only anonymous letters he'd written, but he'd felt driven to his wits' end, fed up with watching silently as people threw accusations at his family based on practically nothing. One of the people who received the letter said they'd never met the Broadduses and had no interest in doing so. The Watcher had been obsessed with 657 Boulevard, and Derek, in turn, had become obsessed with the Watcher and everything the letters had set in motion. "It's like a cancer," he said. "We think about it every day." Sitting at the Westfield train station, Derek showed Weidman his phone so he could read the fourth letter. "You are despised by the house," it read, "and the Watcher won. Remember, call 888-MURDERY so that your Kinda Murdery story, your creepy, your bone-chilling experience can inspire an episode of the show." I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. See you Thursday.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.